Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Betrayal of the American Right by Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard is a well-known libertarian, one of the most well-known libertarians, very hardcore about it, and a very prolific author. This book was written in the early 70s, 1970, 1971, but it was not published. Apparently it was on the verge of being published in the early 90s, but it didn't actually get published until 2007. Interestingly, there was a preface to the 1991 revision, but nothing came of it, and it did not see the light of day at that time. So, after Murray Rothbard passed away in 1995, so this was toward the end of his life when he was going to publish it. It didn't see publication until after he had passed away. And it's a really good and interesting book. There was an essay that was released. I'm not sure, honestly, where it was published, but I did read it. I believe that was called... There was an essay put out in 1964 called "The Transformation of the American Right," where he lays out some of these ideas. And I had read that one, but I hadn't read this one, and I was very happy to get this and look through it. It's a very detailed analysis of some things that we've talked about in some previous episodes, particularly the transformation of the Republican Party and the transformation of the American right wing from the so-called old right to the so-called new right that happened in the 1940s, late 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and really kind of concluded, I suppose, in the 1960s. This terminology of the old right and the new right, as I've said previously, is not particularly precise. Rothbard calls it the original right instead of the old right, although the original right, I think, is also maybe not too accurate. I'm not sure if we could say the original right arose in... he kind of pins it to the 1930s. The original right, I think, probably goes back a little bit older than that. But for lack of a better word, I'm just going to stick with old right for now. The last book that dealt with this was The Odyssey of the American Right, referred to the old nationalists and the new nationalists. Sadly, we don't seem to have real concrete terminology for these various movements at various times. So I'm just going to stick with old right for now, but understand that when I say that, I'm basically referring to the Republican Party's ideological positions from, let's say, the 1930s. I would say probably extending back earlier than that. This is a tradition that had run right through from the previous century in some of its aspects. But we'll say for our purposes now, let's say post-World War I. Rothbard pins it to the opposition to the New Deal, but I think the ideological positions that were opposed to the New Deal were present in the Republican Party from the end of World War I onward, in some form or another. None of this is precise. Parts of what could be called the old right platform date back further to McKinley. Parts of it really don't arise quite until a little bit later. Anyway, I'm going to read a few sections from this book and provide some commentary to what I've read so that you can get it straight from Murray Rothbard's mouth himself. And I want to start with a little bit of the preface here to the 1991 revision, where he sort of states the basic premise and states his basic case succinctly. And in this part, he says, quote, "At the present time, many conservatives have come to realize that the old, feisty, anti-government spirit of conservatives has been abraded and somehow been transformed into its statist opposite. It is tempting, and so far as it goes, certainly correct, to put the blame on the right's embrace in the 1970s of Truman-Humphrey Cold War liberals calling themselves neoconservatives, and to allow these ex-Trotskyites and ex-Mensheviks not only into the tent, but also to take over the show. But the thesis of the book is that those who wonder what happened to the good old cause must not stop with the neocons, that the rot started long before, with the founding in 1955 of National Review and its rapid rise to dominance of the conservative movement. It was National Review that consciously and cleverly transformed the content of the old right into something very like its opposite, while preserving the old forms and rituals, such as lip service to the free market and to the Constitution of the United States. It was, as the great Garrett Garrett said about the New Deal in the American polity, a revolution within the form. As this book points out, the right happened to be vulnerable to takeover at this time, its old leaders recently dead or retired. While younger or yuppie conservatives may puzzle at this statement, the good old days of the old right in politics were not the Goldwater campaign, but the campaign of Robert A. Taft. This book discusses the old right, details the National Review takeover, and treats the odyssey of myself and like-minded libertarians out of our former honored position as the extreme wing of the old right, breaking with National Review conservatism and anxious to find a home for libertarian ideas and activities. The book was written after the end of our alliance with the New Left, which had begun promisingly in the early and mid-1960s but had ended in a mad, if short-lived, orgy of violence and destruction at the end of the decade. The manuscript ends with the beginning of the emergence of the libertarian movement as a separate, self-conscious, ideological, and even political entity in the United States, aiming to be a separate or third force in America, drawing from the congenial elements of both left and right. End quote. So here you see basically his premise that the early Republican Party, the early right wing, was essentially libertarian, and that with the founding of National Review, a new sort of right wing took over, a new sort of concept took over the right wing, took over the conservative movement, took over the Republican Party, driven by Buckley and the founding of National Review, that drove the libertarians out of the movement. And Rothbard, as a libertarian, now found himself politically homeless. He wound up allying with people on the left, particularly in opposition to the Vietnam War. It was largely anti-war. That was a big component of Rothbard's political activities. Obviously, he was a libertarian economist, but his alignment with the left was not really based on economics. I mean, they didn't share his economic positions, but their opposition to war was an important factor of why he wound up allying with what was called the New Left. Again, the New Left of the 1960s, sort of a different type of left, more of a critical theory-based left, more of a socially radical left, as opposed to a labor-based left, class-based left in the 1960s. It was a little bit different. It wasn't the old New Deal liberalism. It was something more radical, more violent, more revolutionary. And ultimately, it didn't work out because of those traits. The libertarian alliance with the left didn't really pan out. But yeah, he talks about like crafting a new libertarian movement on its own that's not attempting to be allied with anyone else. He found problems in trying to ally with the right. He found problems in trying to ally with the left, and began to just identify as a libertarian and to try to build a libertarian movement, a libertarian party, as a third option in American politics. So there you have his basic premise. Then jumping into chapter 1, he starts to define what he means by the old right. He says, quote, "How many Americans realize that not so long ago, the American right wing was almost the exact opposite of what we know today? In fact, how many know that the term establishment itself, now used almost solely as a term of opprobrium by the left, was first applied to America not by C. Wright Mills or other left sociologists, but by National Review theoretician Frank S. Meyer in the early days of that central organ of the American right. In the mid-1950s, Meyer took a term which had previously been used only and rather affectionately to describe the ruling institutions of Great Britain, and applied the term with proper acidity to the American scene. Broader and more subtle than ruling class, more permanent and institutionalized than a power elite, the establishment quickly became a household word. But the ironic and crucial point is that Myers and National Review's use of the term in those days was bitterly critical. The spirit of the right wing, then and particularly earlier, was far more God damn than God bless the establishment. The difference between the two right wings, old and new, and how one was transformed into the other, is the central theme of this book. The old right, which constituted the American right wing from approximately the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s, was, if nothing else, an opposition movement. Hostility to the establishment was its hallmark, its very lifeblood. In fact, when, in the 1950s, the monthly newsletter Right attempted to convey to its readers news of the right wing, it was, of course, forced to define the movement it would be writing about. And it found that it could define the right wing only in negative terms, its total opposition to what it conceived to be the ruling trends of American life. In brief, the old right was born and had its being as the opposition movement to the New Deal, and to everything, foreign and domestic, that the New Deal encompassed. At first, to burgeoning New Deal statism at home, and then, later in the 30s, to the drive for American global intervention abroad. Since the essence of the old right was a reaction against runaway big government at home and overseas, this meant that the old right was necessarily, even if not always consciously, libertarian rather than statist, radical rather than traditional conservative apologists for the existing order. End quote. So, yeah, a couple things here. You see where he says, as I mentioned, that the old right kind of starts in the mid-30s. He says this was the American right wing from the mid-30s to the mid-50s, and it was an opposition movement. And he talks about the term the establishment, and you hear about the establishment. This is kind of a term that was used in the 60s, talking about the powers that be, the establishment, the man. The term was originally used by Frank Meyer, and there certainly were a lot of writers, even when you think of something like the managerial class. There were a lot of writers who were in opposition to big government and statism and the nanny state at home, as well as American intervention abroad. It was essentially libertarian, and that's what he's really saying here, is that it was essentially a libertarian movement. And one thing that I notice is how he talks about how the early right wing, the old right, was really an opposition movement in that it didn't exactly know what it stood for so much as it stood for opposition to the existing regime, which brings me back to an essay. I forget the name of the essay, The Initiation of Air, I believe it was, in Julius Evola's Handbook for Right-Wing Youth, which talks about how important it is to know what you stand for, that if all of your opposition, if everything that you oppose was suddenly gone, what would you do? If you didn't have these other forces to push against, and you were just sort of floating in politics without anything to align yourself against, what would be left of you? What would you say must be done? What would you stand for and not just against? That's an important thing, and it may be that some element of the old right's decline can be traced to the fact that it couldn't clearly, specifically elucidate what exactly it was for. Who knows? Let's move on to the next section, where he talks about the shifting and changing of the terms right and left, and the beginning of what came to be called the old right. He says, quote, "In the late 1930s, the Roosevelt administration moved rapidly toward war in Europe and the Far East. As it did so, and especially after war broke out in September 1939, the great bulk of the liberals and the left flip-flopped drastically on behalf of war and foreign intervention. Gone without a trace was the old left's insight into the evils of the Versailles Treaty, the Allied dismemberment of Germany, and the need for revision of the treaty. Gone was the old opposition to American militarism and to American and British imperialism. Not only that, but to the liberals and left, the impending war against Germany and even Japan became a great moral crusade, a people's war for democracy and against fascism, outrivaling in the absurdity of their rhetoric the very Wilsonian apologia for World War I that these same liberals had repudiated for 2 decades. The president, who was dragging the nation reluctantly into war, was now lauded and almost deified by the left, as were, in retrospect, all of the strong, i.e. dictatorial, presidents throughout American history. For liberals and the left, the pantheon of America now became, in almost endless litany, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, FDR. Still worse was the attitude of these new interventionists toward those erstwhile friends and allies who continued to persist in their old beliefs. These latter were now castigated and denounced day in and day out, with extreme bitterness and venom as reactionaries, fascists, anti-Semites, and followers of the Goebbels line. Joining with great enthusiasm in this smear campaign was the Communist Party and its allies, from the collective security campaign of the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, and again after the Nazi attack on Russia on June 22, 1941. Before and during the war, the Communists were delighted to leap to their newfound role as American super patriots, proclaiming that communism is 20th century Americanism, and that any campaign for social justice within America had to take a back seat to the sacred goal of victory in the war. The only exception for the Communists in this role was their isolationist period, which, again in subservience to the needs of the Soviet Union, lasted from the time of the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939 to the attack on Russia 2 years later. The pressure upon the liberals and progressives who continued to oppose the coming war was unbelievably bitter and intense. Many personal tragedies resulted. Charles A. Beard, distinguished historian and most eminent of revisionists, was castigated unmercifully by the liberals, many of them his former students and disciples. Dr. Harry Elmer Barnes, the liberal dean of World War I and later World War II revisionists, whose New York World Telegram column The Liberal Viewpoint had achieved the eminence of Walter Lippmann, was unceremoniously kicked out of his column in May 1940 by the pressure of pro-war advertisers. Typical of the treatment accorded to those who held fast to their principles was the purgation from the ranks of liberal journalism of John T. Flynn and Oswald Garrison Villard. End quote. Okay, so back in the Prophets on the Right a few episodes back, we saw John Flynn and Oswald Garrison Villard, who he mentions at the end there, as liberals, or starting as liberals, who basically got kicked out of liberal journalism because of their position in opposition to the war. And he's basically describing a massive flip-flop from people from the left who at one point were opposed to militarism and opposed to imperialism and opposed to war in general, were opposed to the Versailles Treaty, left who had basically been anti-war. Once it was their president, their FDR, advocating for war, moving the nation into war, they all changed their story. And he talks about the communists and how the communists had changed their story several times, as they did whatever Soviet Russia wanted to do. When Soviet Russia was against the Nazis, they were against the Nazis. Then when Soviet Russia signed a pact with the Nazis, then they were anti-war. Then when the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, they were back to being war hawks. So whatever was in the best interest of the Soviet Union is what the communists wanted. And it seems like the liberals had a similar course. And they come up with the same story again that was used in World War I, the war for democracy, the People's War for Democracy, sort of ideological justifications for what would turn out to be, in my opinion, catastrophic to Europe and the Western world. These world wars were utterly devastating to generations of men, and the post-war order is a cancer on Western civilization that would have never come about if it hadn't been for these wars. I think the damage done to our civilization by these wars cannot be overstated. But that's going a little bit past what he's talking about here. But I think it is apparent from the other book that we read, as well as the points that he's making here, that the left and right kind of shift their positions. Obviously, this still happens today. Left and right changes. The Republican Party is changing as we speak. The Democratic Party is changing. The working class used to be in support of the Democrats. That is changing. Unions used to be in opposition to immigration. That has changed. Things are just slowly changing. The rank and file union members very oftentimes are Republicans, which didn't used to be the case. Although union leadership, being more entrenched, is slower to change. The union leadership tends to be more allied with the Democratic Party, but I don't think the rank and file supports that. So the point is the parties are always changing, shifting. We shouldn't be dramatically surprised by that. I think different underlying ideas come to the surface that we don't really realize were there. People's motivations change as well. So this is something that we should kind of expect to have happen. And I think that one thing that is apparent as the parties change their positions on various issues is that the terms right and left, just like the term old right and new right being sort of vague and meaningless on its whole, left and right are really just directions. You're driving a car, you turn left or you turn right. That's really what the words left and right mean. And any additional meaning that we apply to them to say that, well, the left is big government and the right is small government, or the left is against tradition and the right is for tradition, or whatever definition you want to use to apply to right and left, there's no true definition. The true definition is pointing in the left direction, pointing in the right direction. That's the true definition, and everything else is superimposed upon it. And if one era decides to draw the lines of what left and right mean in a different way than another era attempts to draw those lines, there's no logical case to be made that one era has a correct or better understanding of what right and left mean. I think that's something that's kind of apparent to me, and Rothbard, I think, makes a bit of a mistake here in parts of this book trying to uncover what the left and the right really mean. They don't really mean anything. So moving on from there, he talks about how the additional changes in the right and left. He talks about how the isolationists, the old isolationists, having been kicked out of liberalism, began to move rightward. He says, quote, "The drive of the New Deal toward war once again reshuffled the ideological spectrum and the meaning of left and right in American politics. The left and liberal opponents of war were hounded out of the media and journals of opinion by their erstwhile allies and condemned as reactionaries and Neanderthals. These men, as well as old progressives hailed by the left a few short years before, such as Senators Nye, La Follette, and Wheeler, found themselves forced into a new alliance with laissez-faire Republicans from the Middle West. Damned everywhere as ultra-conservatives and extreme rightists, many of these allies found themselves moving rightward ideologically as well, moving toward the laissez-faire liberalism of the only mass base yet open to them. In many ways, their move rightward was a self-fulfilling prophecy by the left. Thus, under the hammer blows of the left liberal establishment, the old progressive isolationists moved laissez-faire-ward as well. It was under this pressure that the forging of the old right was completed, and the ugly role of the Communist Party as spearhead of the smear campaign understandably turned many of these progressives not only into classical liberals, but into thoroughgoing and almost fanatical anti-communists as well. This is what happened to John T. Flynn and John Dos Passos, what happened to some extent to Charles A. Beard, and what happened to such former sympathizers of the Soviet Union as John Chamberlain, Frida Utley, and William Henry Chamberlain. To a large extent, it was their uncomfortable third camp or isolationist position on the war that started such leading Trotskyites as Max Schachtman and James Burnham down the road to the later global anti-communist crusade, and that led the Trotskyist pacifist Dwight MacDonald to his bitter opposition to the Henry Wallace campaign of 1948. The venom directed against the opponents of war by the left liberal establishment war coalition was almost unbelievable. Responsible publicists regularly and systematically accused the isolationists of being fascists and members of a Nazi transmission belt. Walter Winchell, at the beginning of his long-time career as a calumniator of all dissent against American war crusades, he was later a fervent supporter of Joe McCarthy and always, early and late, a devoted fan of the FBI, led in denouncing the opponents of war. While communist leader William Z. Foster denounced isolationist leaders General Wood and Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh as conscious fascists, interventionist publicist Dorothy Thompson accused the America First Committee of being Vichy fascists, and Secretary of the Interior Harold C. Ikes, the bully boy of the Roosevelt administration, denounced Wood and Lindbergh as Nazi fellow travelers, and pinned the same label on his old friend Oswald Garrison Villard. And Time and Life, whose publisher Harry Luce was an ardent supporter not only of our entry into the war but also of the American century, which he envisioned as emerging after the war, stooped so low as to claim that Lindbergh's and Senator Wheeler's salutes to the American flag were similar to the fascist salute. An organization that became almost a professional vilifier of the Isolationists was the left-liberal Reverend Leon M. Burkhead's Friends of Democracy, which denounced the America First Committee as a Nazi front. It's a transmission belt by means of which the apostles of Nazism are spreading their anti-democratic ideas into millions of American homes. The oppression of the Isolationists was not confined to vilification or loss of employment. In numerous cities such as Miami, Atlanta, Oklahoma City, Portland, Oregon, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, the America First Committee found it difficult or impossible to obtain halls for public meetings. Another tactic that was used systematically before, during, and immediately after the war was private espionage against the old right by interventionist groups. These agents employed deception, abused confidences, stole documents, and then published sensationalistic findings. Sometimes these agents acted as agents provocateurs. The most famous use of private secret agents was that of the Friends of Democracy, who sent Avidus Darunian into the isolationist groups under the name of John Roy Carlson. Carlson's report on his adventures was published as the best-selling Undercover by Dutton in 1943. Carlson's book lumped isolationists, anti-Semites, and actual pro-Nazis together in a potpourri of guilt by association as constituting the Nazi underworld of America. End quote. So you can see just how a couple things here. Number one, two real points. Number one is that the isolationists, under the constant attack by the liberals, moved rightward and began to embrace laissez-faire economics. They moved into the camp. So rightward, in Murray's understanding, is in the direction of classical liberalism, libertarianism, laissez-faire economics, small government. That is the right, and that is rightward. And so as these left-wing opponents of entry into World War II begin getting hammered from the left, they, unsurprisingly, move rightward toward the camp of the only people who will have them. And they also, because the communists are such major participants in the attacks against them as being reactionaries and fascists and so on, they wind up becoming very anti-communist. And he does talk about just how serious and at the same time comical the accusations are. Constantly being accused of being Nazis. Even the way they salute the flag, they say that's very similar to a fascist salute. It just seems a little silly. They're all called Nazis, Nazi fellow travelers. You see the phrase come up again and again, Nazi transmission belt, bringing the ideas of Nazism into the homes of Americans. Everyone getting lumped together and vilified. They have a hard time finding places to have their meetings. No venue will allow the America First Committee in, and they lose their jobs, and so on and so forth. And it's really just a little over the top. They sent in secret agents to spy on them. Just a little over the top. The criticism of the America First Committee and the criticism of the isolationists. So from here, I'm going to jump forward quite a bit into a later part of the book when he talks about the end of the old right, how the old right ultimately fell apart. Now you can see he describes as sort of, in a way, the forming of the old right was when these isolationists bound up with the libertarians. And just to jump back to what I just read, he says, under the hammer blows of the left liberal establishment, the old progressive isolationists moved laissez-faire-ward as well. It was under this pressure that the forging of the old right was completed. So basically, the progressive isolationists joined the camp of the laissez-faire economists, and the old right is forged. So that's sort of the beginning of the old right. He's tracing this back to the 30s and really in the lead up to World War II. As a libertarian, Murray Rothbard very much identifies the old right with libertarianism. And so when this sort of anti-war, isolationist, non-interventionist, pro-free market coalition begins to form, it does have a very libertarian aspect to it. He doesn't talk about things like protectionism in here very much at all. That's not a libertarian idea. And so to him, that doesn't constitute a major important part of the old right. His vision of the old right is when the libertarian elements coalesce. The protectionism had been around a lot longer than the 1930s, had been a part of the Republican movement, the Republican Party, for decades and decades before that. But that doesn't constitute the founding of the old right until it really takes on the isolationist, non-interventionist foreign policy. That, to Rothbard, that's where the old right really begins to form. So anyway, moving on to when the old right begins to collapse, he says, quote, "The great watershed, the single event that most marked the passing of the old isolationist right, was the defeat of Senator Taft by Eisenhower in the Wall Street capture of the 1952 presidential nomination. With the Democrats vulnerable, 1952 was at last a chance for the old right to achieve dominance on the national scene. But the defeat of Taft and the outrageous Eisenhower theft of the nomination, coupled with the death of the great senator the following year, ended the old right as a significant faction of the Republican Party. In effect, it also was to end my own identification with republicanism and with the extreme right on the political spectrum. I had not been active in the Young Republican Club since the disappointment of the Dewey nomination in 1948, but I was still a member, and Ronnie Hertz, a libertarian friend of mine, exercised some clout in the club as head of its Midtown Luncheon Committee, to which we invited isolationist and libertarian speakers. I was not a Taft enthusiast on any absolute scale because of his repeated compromises and sellouts in domestic and foreign affairs, and in the climactic meeting of the club that voted for the presidential endorsement, in which Taft won a sizable minority, Ronnie and I cast our 2 votes for Senator Everett Dirksen, Republican from Illinois. In that more innocent day, Dirksen had not yet won his stripes as the supreme political opportunist. Instead, under the aegis of the Chicago Tribune, he had then a solidly extremist voting record, including one of the few votes cast against the draft. But in the momentous convention itself, I was, of course, for Taft, and still more in opposition to the leftist, corporate liberal Wall Street takeover, which conquered on the crest of an outrageous press campaign implying that Taft had stolen the Southern delegations. When Taft was cheated out of the nomination, I, for one, walked out of the Republican Party never to return. In the election, I supported Stevenson, largely as the only way to get the Wall Street incubus off the back of the Republican Party. It is important to note that the later 1960s Republican right wing, the Goldwater Buckley right, had no connection with the old Taft right, even organizationally. Thus, Barry Goldwater was himself an Eisenhower delegate from Arizona. The conservative warmonger Senator General Pat Hurley was an Eisenhower man from New Mexico. The 2 doyens of the China lobby were anti-Taft, Representative Walter Judd, Republican of Minnesota, being for Eisenhower, and Senator William Nolan, Republican of California, being a supporter of Governor Earl Warren, who was decisive in throwing his support to Ike on the Southern delegate question. Richard Nixon was also instrumental in the California deal, and both Nixon and Warren went on to their suitable rewards. And furthermore, the famous Southern delegation fight was scarcely what it seemed on the surface. The Taft delegations in the South were largely Negro, hence their name of Black and Tan, and were led by the veteran black Republican Perry Howard of Mississippi, whereas the Eisenhower delegations, the representatives of the progressive white suburbanite businessmen of the Southern Republican future, were known quite properly as the Lily Whites. End quote. So a couple things here. Number one, the end, he identifies the end of the old right with the defeat of Senator Taft in the 1952 presidential nomination. Now, Taft had died the following year, so he wouldn't have even gotten to live out his first term as president had he won. But nevertheless, he presumably would have had a decent vice who would have been able to carry on for him. I am not deeply opposed to Eisenhower, and I don't know the real details, and he doesn't go into an awful lot of the details of how Taft lost the nomination process. Apparently there was a question about the Southern delegates. There were two groups of delegates, Taft delegates from the South and Eisenhower delegates from the South, and there was a dispute over who were the correct delegates or something. I don't know a tremendous amount about this. It's probably pretty interesting, though, and I would like to maybe learn a little bit more. There is one additional section I'll just read here. This is Rothbard quoting from the Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune was a very pro-old right publication. The center of the old right power was the Midwest at that time, as I've said previously. Illinois, Chicago, the Chicago Tribune, the University of Chicago. The America First Committee was based in Chicago. So the Chicago Tribune reporter talks about the delegate fight, and I'll just read this, and that's about as much as we're going to get of the real details of what happened during that delegate fight. He says, quote, "New York banks, connected with the country's great corporations by financial ties and interlocking directorates, exerted their powerful influence on the large uncommitted delegations for Eisenhower. They did it more subtly, but no less effectively, than in 1940 when they captured the Republican convention for Wilkie. Having made enormous profits out of foreign aid and armament orders, the bankers and corporation bosses understood each other perfectly. The Wall Street influence was most fruitful in the Pennsylvania delegation and in that of Michigan. Arthur Summerfield, Michigan's national committeeman and the largest Chevrolet dealer in the world, was rewarded for his delivery of the bulk of the Michigan delegation by appointment as Eisenhower's campaign manager and later as his postmaster general. Charles E. Wilson, president of the General Motors Corporation, which had strong influence in the Michigan delegation, became Secretary of Defense. Winthrop W. Aldrich, head of the Chase National Bank and kinsman of the Rockefeller brothers, the front man for Wall Street, was in Chicago pulling wires for Eisenhower, and his labors paid off with an appointment as ambassador to Great Britain." End quote. So that's from the Chicago Tribune, and frankly doesn't say all that much other than that New York bankers and Wall Street Republicans, the Eastern establishment, were pulling strings and manipulating the delegates. Apparently there are large uncommitted delegations. I don't know entirely how the process worked then. I don't think we really have uncommitted delegates today in the Republican Party. This might be the so-called superdelegates that the Democrats still have. Oddly, it's not a particularly democratic process to have superdelegates. I'm not necessarily opposed to it because I'm not a total democracy fanboy, but the Democratic Party, which tends to profess itself as the more pro-democracy party, its own delegations are not as democratic as the Republican ones on account of the superdelegates. Their conventions are not as democratic, and we all know how Kamala Harris did not have to face a primary at all and was just sort of adopted. Oddly, that was an interesting instance because all of the delegates after the primary, the delegates were committed to Biden. But when Biden withdrew his name from the race, all those delegates became uncommitted. They weren't obligated to make Kamala Harris the nominee. But on Joe Biden's endorsement and his request that his delegates vote for Kamala, that's just what they all did. So there could have been a contested convention among the Democrats, but I guess they didn't really want to have to deal with a contested convention, especially nowadays. It's much more in the public eye than it was back in 1952, so they all just did what Biden wanted. But that's neither here nor there. At any rate, the Eisenhower defeat of the Taft nomination, he points to that and says that was basically the end of the old right. One delegation fight in the fight for president. It's tough to see how an entire movement ended with that one in one fell swoop like that. But times were different back then, and lots more was accomplished in smoky back rooms. And if there was an alt-right movement of people, an alt-right voter base, they would nowadays have a lot of sway. And even then, it seems like they should have had a fair amount of sway in getting their people elected. But at any rate, they didn't, and they lost control of the party. So continuing on with the end of the alt-right, he talks a little bit about McCarthy. And Rothbard was a supporter of Joe McCarthy. And McCarthy's his aggressive campaign to root out communists from the government. And talking a little bit about that, he says, quote, "The 50s was an era when liberalism, now accurately termed corporate liberalism, had triumphed and seemed to be permanently in the saddle. Having now gained the seats of power, the liberals had given up their radical veneer of the 30s and were now settling down to the cozy enjoyment of their power and perquisites. It was a comfortable alliance of Wall Street, big business, big government, big unions, and liberal Ivy League intellectuals. It seemed to me that while in the long run this unholy alliance could only be overthrown by educating a new generation of intellectuals, that in the short run the only hope to dislodge this new ruling elite was a populist short circuit. In sum, that there was a vital need to appeal directly to the masses, emotionally, even demagogically, over the heads of the establishment, of the Ivy League, the mass media, the liberal intellectuals, of the Republican-Democrat political party structure. This could be done, especially in that period of no organized opposition whatever, only by a charismatic leader, a leader who could make a direct appeal to the masses, and thereby undercut the ruling and opinion-molding elite. In sum, by a populist short circuit. It seemed to me that this was what McCarthy was trying to do, and that it was largely this appeal, this open-ended sense that there was no audacity of which McCarthy was not capable, that frightened the liberals, who, from their opposite side of the fence, also saw that the only danger to their rule was in just such a whipping up of populist emotions. My own quip at the time, which roughly summed up this position, was that in contrast to the liberals, who approved of McCarthy's ends, ouster of communists from offices and jobs, but disapproved of his radical and demagogic means, I, myself, approved his means, radical assault on the nation's power structure, but not necessarily his ends. It is surely no accident that, with their power consolidated and a populist appeal their only fear, the liberal intellectuals began to push hard for their proclamation of the end of ideology. Hence their claim that ideology and hard-nosed doctrines were no longer valuable or viable, and their ardent celebration of the newfound American consensus. With such enemies and for such reasons, it was hard for me not to be a McCarthyite." End quote. So that's interesting. It sounds like a lot of an echo of the present era. He talks about how the liberals were radical back in the 30s, had a radical veneer. I think even in the 30s was when we're talking about, the ouster of some of the liberal elites who were in opposition to the war. Probably could go back. The 30s were called the Red Decade too. Communism was more popular in the 30s than it had been before or since. But even in the 20s, I think you had the rising communists and socialists and left, or sort of a radical left. The Republicans tended to be in power in the 20s, and the liberals were radical opposition agitators, and by the 50s the liberals were in power, and so all of their radical veneer had washed off, and now they were settling down to a cozy enjoyment of their power and perquisites. It's an alliance, he says, of Wall Street, big business, big government, big unions, and liberal Ivy League intellectuals. And that doesn't sound too far from where we are now, does it? In many ways, sort of the liberals have won the war in many respects, or it seems to be. They've captured all of the institutions. And it's funny, looking back to the 1950s, we say, well, that was in many ways a much better era, and it has happened since then that the 60s radicals have captured the institutions. But even in the 1950s, Rothbard says, the liberals had captured the institutions by the 50s. And interestingly, he says, at this point, the only thing that could stop them is populism. The masses of the people rising up and saying no. They have to go over the heads of the establishment, over the head of the mass media, over the head of the liberal intellectuals, over the head of the Republican-Democrat political party structure, and that could only be done by a charismatic leader who could make a direct appeal to the masses and undercut the opinion-molding elite. A populist short circuit. Doesn't that sound kind of like Trump? We need somebody who's not going to try to go through the existing channels, the interviews, and he does interviews, but he's not constrained by, doing the same interviews with the same people and submitting meekishly to the same questions and constantly defending himself against, scurrilous accusations, willing to go the extra mile, willing to be audacious, in order to whip up the emotions of the population. He says that was needed at that time because the liberal establishment had to be dislodged in some way. And so he was a McCarthyist for those reasons. And interestingly, he says that he wasn't even really that concerned with communists in government. He just liked to see the liberals get attacked because they needed to get pushed out of their position. It wasn't just the communists that were the problem. It was the entire liberal establishment that was the problem, not just the communists. And so he loved to see the attacks on the establishment. So continuing on from there a little bit shortly afterwards, he says, quote, "Since I failed to understand the interplay of domestic and foreign red baiting that was at work in the McCarthy movement, I was bewildered when McCarthy, after his outrageous censure by the Senate in late 1954, turned to whooping it up for war on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek in Asia. Why this turnabout? It was clear that the new right forces behind McCarthy were now convinced that domestic red baiting, angering as it did the center-right establishment, had become counterproductive, and that from now on the full stress must be on pushing for war against communism abroad. In retrospect, it is clear that a major force for this turn was the sinister figure of the millionaire Far Eastern importer Alfred Kohlberg, a major backer of McCarthy, who supplied him with much of his material and boasted of his position as dean of the powerful China lobby on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek. While a failure in the short run, the McCarthy movement had done its work of shifting the entire focus of the right wing from libertarian, anti-statist, and isolationist concerns to a focus and concentration upon the alleged communist menace. A diversion from domestic to foreign affairs would not only consolidate the right wing, it would also draw no real opposition from liberals and internationalist Republicans who had, after all, begun the Cold War in the first place. The short-run collapse of the McCarthy movement was clearly due, furthermore, to the lack of any sort of McCarthyite organization. There were leaders, there was press support, there was a large mass base, but there were no channels of organization, no intermediary links, either in journals of opinion or of more direct popular organizations, between the leaders and the base. In late 1955, William F. Buckley and his newly formed weekly National Review set out to remedy that task. In 1951, when Bill Buckley first burst upon the scene with his God and Man at Yale, he liked to refer to himself as libertarian, or even at times as an anarchist. For in those early days, Buckley's major ideological mentor was Frank Chodorov, rather than, as it would soon become, the notorious Whittaker Chambers. But even in those early libertarian days, there was one clinker that made his libertarianism only phony rhetoric: the global anti-communist crusade. Thus, taking one of Buckley's early efforts, A Young Republican's View, published in Commonweal January 25, 1952, Buckley began the article in unexceptionable libertarian fashion, affirming that the enemy is the state and endorsing the view of Herbert Spencer that the state is begotten of aggression and by aggression. Buckley also contributed excellent quotations from such leading individualists of the past as H.L. Mencken and Albert J. Nock, and criticized the Republican Party for offering no real alternative to the burgeoning of statism. But then, in the remainder of the article, he gave the case away, for there loomed the alleged Soviet menace, and all libertarian principles had to go by the board for the duration. Thus, Buckley declared that the thus far invincible aggressiveness of the Soviet Union imminently threatens American security, and that therefore we have to accept big government for the duration. For neither an offensive nor a defensive war can be waged except through the instrument of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores. In short, a totalitarian bureaucracy must be accepted so long as the Soviet Union exists, presumably for its alleged threat of imposing upon us a totalitarian bureaucracy. In consequence, Buckley concluded that we must all support the extensive and productive tax laws that are needed to support a vigorous anti-communist foreign policy, as well as large armies and air forces, atomic energy, central intelligence, war production boards, and the attendant centralization of power in Washington, even with Truman at the reins of it all. Thus, even at his most libertarian, even before Buckley came to accept big government and morality laws as ends in themselves, the pretended National Review fusion between liberty and order, between individualism and anti-communism, was a phony. The individualist and libertarian part of the fusion was strictly rhetorical, to be saved for abstract theorizing and after-dinner discourse. The guts of the new conservatism was the mobilization of big government for the worldwide crusade against communism. End quote. Okay, so he's pretty harsh here on Bill Buckley. He starts out talking about McCarthy, and he says that he failed to understand the interplay of domestic and foreign red baiting. So while he was all in favor of McCarthy's going after the communists in the U.S. government and attacking the liberal establishment, once McCarthy started to be less useful, he was sort of pushed by others, his backers, into more of a anti-communist foreign policy. Not so concerned with rooting out the communists in the government and more concerned with prosecuting the Cold War and opposing the spread of communism overseas. And Rothbard's like, wait, what? How did that happen? He didn't understand that you can't be anti-communist at home and then soft on communism overseas. He realized that the whole thing was one kit and caboodle, and prosecuting the Cold War was the same thing overseas as it was at home. And so at that point, he began to no longer feel like he was quite the supporter of McCarthy, but he began to understand more about politics. And he says that the reason that the McCarthy movement didn't really last was because there wasn't any real McCarthyite organization. There wasn't a real connection between the people and who were organizing, like McCarthy, and politicians who supported him, and the masses of people. Specifically, he says there were leaders, there was press support, there was a large mass base, but there were no channels of organization, no intermediary links, no connection from the press to the people, no connection from the leaders to the people. There wasn't really. So when he says press support, I'm not sure what he's really referring to, other than maybe the Chicago Tribune, but there wasn't anything that was really filling the need to be directly and explicitly conservative McCarthyite publication. At any rate, he says in 1955, Buckley in the new weekly National Review was trying to fill that void, but he says that Buckley tried to refer to himself as a libertarian. He tried to play the libertarian game, but it was all a ruse, because once it came down to his real beliefs, in this 1952 essay, before National Review even appears, he says some kind of remarkable things. He quotes H.L. Mencken, he quotes Albert J. Nock, he reaffirms Herbert Spencer, he drops all these libertarian ideas in the beginning of this essay, and then Buckley says that, well, all that has to sort of get set aside for the duration. He says that in order to combat the invincible aggressiveness of the Soviet Union, and this is directly pulled from Buckley's essay, quote, we have to accept big government for the duration. For neither an offensive nor a defensive war can be waged except through the instrument of a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores. End quote. That's directly from Bill Buckley, before he even founds National Review. So everything has to be subservient to the anti-communist crusade. We can make all of our libertarian statements about the state and about freedom and everything else, but when it comes right down to it, we have to put all that on hold. We have to embrace big government. We have to embrace totalitarian bureaucracy. We have to do what we have to do because that's what we need to do to win the Cold War. And we've, especially those of us on the right, have just sort of adopted the view that, well, Reagan won the Cold War, the communists are bad. We had to engage in the Cold War because we had to resist communist Russia. We had to resist the Soviet Union and the spread of communism across the globe. And it's, in some sense, you want to say, yeah, that sounds probably about right. But Rothbard makes a decent case, and others have made a decent case that maybe the Cold War itself was just not that necessary, especially when you consider that the various hot conflicts that took part as a part of it weren't particularly successful, and yet the Soviet Union fell anyway. This isn't really a book about the Cold War. This is getting to the end of the book at the section that I'm reading here. He goes on from here and talks about his involvement with the left, but we don't get a really deep, thorough analysis of the viability of the Cold War and the appropriateness of the Cold War in this book. But he certainly raises some questions about whether or not that was really appropriate. And he also talks about fusionism, and he says the fusionism was just, BS. It was a ruse. The libertarian side of the fusion between, maybe both sides of fusionism were a bit of a ruse, because fusionism was really not anti-communism and libertarianism. It was traditionalism and libertarianism aligned, fused in pursuit of a single goal, which was anti-communism. So so far as the libertarians are anti-communist, they're welcome as a part of the coalition. So far as the traditionalists are anti-communist, they're welcome as part of the coalition. But the reason that they are coming together, these disparate groups of people, these disparate ideologies are coming together, is for the cause of anti-communism. The other thing that's interesting is he says, for the duration, the Soviet Union is over and done with, but none of the big government advances, the increases in the size and power and scope of government, have been rolled back now that the Cold War is over. All those sort of temporary abridgments of our freedoms, a temporary downplaying of libertarianism, none of that stuff got rolled back. None of that stuff got walked back by people who said, okay, well, game over, we won. Now it's time to get back to what we really believe. That didn't happen. That didn't happen for the vast majority of public Republicans at the time of the end of the Cold War. It switched instead to global American hegemony. We were the sole remaining superpower, and we had every intention of keeping it that way. So one wonders how much of it all has all been BS from then till now. And, I'm not a libertarian per se, although I think that some libertarian ideas are good ones. I don't think it's the beginning and end of political ideology. The libertarian agenda has to be tempered by other agendas and other things that are also important that are outside the scope of libertarianism. But it is, it is a little bit disappointing to see how the old right of Taft, the old Republican Party, which was not a bunch of maniacs. I mean, Taft was a very serious major senator who was the leading contender against Eisenhower for the presidential nomination. And there were whole swaths of Republican voters and elected officials and outlets that were part of the old right. And the whole thing just sort of fell apart in the Cold War. And the loss of Taft in 1952 and the creation of National Review to become the voice of conservatism, those were really the stakes in the heart of the old right. And so, Pat Buchanan, I wouldn't call Pat Buchanan a libertarian, but in many ways he embodies some of the ideas of the old right, and he talks about recovering the original qualities of the Republican Party that were sort of set on hold a little bit during the course of the Cold War. So for this last section, I'm going to read, he continues talking a little bit about the founding of National Review, where he says, quote, "So, when National Review was founded with much expertise and financing in late 1955, the magazine was a coming together to direct the newly transformed right wing on the part of two groups, all the veteran ex-communist journalists and intellectuals, and the new group of younger Catholics whose major goal was anti-communism. Thus, the central and guiding theme for both groups in this unholy coalition was the extirpation of communism at home and particularly abroad. Prominent on the new magazine were leading ex-leftists, James Burnham, former Trotskyite, Frank S. Meyer, formerly on the National Committee of the Communist Party and head of its Chicago training school, ex-German communist leader William S. Schlamm, Dr. J.B. Matthews, ex-leftist Max Eastman, ex-communist Ralph de Toledano, former leading German communist theoretician Professor Karl Wittfogel, John Chamberlain, a leading leftist intellectual of the 30s, ex-fellow traveler Eugene Lyons, ex-communist Will Herberg, former communist spy Whittaker Chambers, and a whole slew of others. The Catholic wing consisted of two parts. One was a charming but ineffectual group of older European or European-oriented monarchists and authoritarians. For example, the erudite Austrian Erich von Kuhnel-Leddihn, the poet Roy Campbell, the pro-Spanish Carlist Frederick Wilhelmsen, and the Englishman Sir Arnold Lunn. I remember one night a heated discussion at a conservative gathering about the respective merits of the Habsburgs, the Stuarts, the Bourbons, the Carlists, the crown of St. Stephen, and the crown of St. Wenceslas, and which monarchy should be restored first. Whatever the merits of the monarchist position, this was not an argument relevant to the American tradition, let alone the American cultural and political scene of the day. In retrospect, did Buckley keep this group around as exotic trimming, as an intellectual counterpart to his own social jet set? The other wing of young Catholics was far more important for the purposes of the new magazine. These were the younger American anti-communists, most prominently the various members of the Buckley family, who, in closeness and lifestyle, has seemed a right-wing version of the Kennedys, which included at first Buckley's brother-in-law and college roommate L. Brent Bozell, and Buckley's then favorite disciple, later turned leftist, Gary Wills. Rounding out the Catholic aura at National Review was the fact that two of its leading editors became Catholic converts, Frank Meyer and political scientist Wilmore Kendall. It was the essence of National Review as an anti-communist organ that accounted for its being a coalition of ex-Stalinists and Trotskyites and younger Catholics, and led observers to remark on the curious absence of American Protestants, who had, of course, been the staple of the old right from the heart of the Buckleyite New Right. In this formidable but profoundly statist grouping, interest in individual liberty was minimal or negative, being largely confined to some of the book reviews by John Chamberlain and to whatever time Frank Meyer could manage to take off from advocacy of all-out war against the Soviet bloc. Interest in free market economics was minimal and largely rhetorical, confined to occasional pieces by Henry Hazlitt, who for his part had never been an isolationist and who had endorsed the hardline foreign policy of the magazine. In the light of hindsight, we should now ask whether or not a major objective of National Review from its inception was to transform the right wing from an isolationist to global warmongering anti-communist movement, and particularly whether or not the entire effort was in essence a CIA operation. We now know that Bill Buckley, for the 2 years prior to establishing National Review, was admittedly a CIA agent in Mexico City, and that the sinister E. Howard Hunt was his control. His sister, Priscilla, who became managing editor of National Review, was also in the CIA, and other editors, James Burnham and Wilmore Kendall, had at least been recipients of CIA largesse in the Anti-Communist Congress for Cultural Freedom. In addition, Burnham has been identified by two reliable sources as a consultant for the CIA in the years after World War II. Moreover, Gary Wills relates in his memoirs of the conservative movement that Frank Meyer, to whom he was close at the time, was convinced that the magazine was a CIA operation. With his Leninist-trained nose for intrigue, Meyer must be considered an important witness. Furthermore, it was a standard practice in the CIA, at least in those early years, that no one ever resigned from the CIA. A friend of mine who joined the agency in the early 1950s told me that if, before the age of retirement, he was mentioned as having left the CIA for another job, that I was to disregard it, since it would only be a cover for continuing agency work. On that testimony, the case for NR being a CIA operation becomes even stronger. Also suggestive is the fact that a character even more sinister than E. Howard Hunt, William J. Casey, appears at key moments of the establishment of the new over the old right. It was Casey who, as attorney, presided over the incorporation of National Review and had arranged the details of the ouster of Felix Morley from Human Events. At any rate, in retrospect, it is clear that libertarians and old rightists, including myself, had made a great mistake in endorsing domestic red baiting, a red baiting that proved to be the major entering wedge for the complete transformation of the original right wing. We should have listened more carefully to Frank Chodorov and to his splendidly libertarian stand on domestic red baiting. How to get rid of the communists in the government? Easy, just abolish the jobs. It was the jobs and their functioning that was the important thing, not the quality of the people who happened to fill them. End quote. Okay, so here we have some more on the founding of National Review, and he talks about Catholics and ex-communists, and in particular about the ex-communists and the ex-leftists. It really is remarkable, and this is true of the neoconservatives as well, but it was also true of the founders of National Review, just how many of them were former leftists. And I don't mean people who may have voted for a Democrat when they were 18, 19, 20 years old, who voted for a Democrat because they thought that was the thing to do, because that was the popular. We're talking people who were leaders in the communist movement. We're talking about like Frank Meyer, who, and I've read a book by Frank Meyer and a book edited by Frank Meyer on this podcast, and I like Frank Meyer. But Frank Meyer was on the National Committee of the Communist Party. James Burnham, all these guys, Max Eastman, of course, Whittaker Chambers, and, he just lists a whole slew of them who were former leftists, leading leftist intellectuals, who, for one reason or another, soured on leftism or soured on communism, decided to turn against communism. And I think that the conversion from communism seems like it's authentic, although I can't say with any certainty. I can't get inside these guys' heads, but from their writings, it seems as though they really did, I've read James Burnham on this show, a book by James Burnham, Suicide of the West. Good book. His other book, The Machiavellians, I've read but haven't reviewed yet, but good book. But nevertheless, it's remarkable how many people who were at the helm or major influencers writing for National Review in its earliest days were all ex-communists, all ex-leftists. It just kind of makes one wonder, as one is prone to do sometimes, why the people who only showed up to conservatism or only showed up to the Republican Party within the last, limited number of years, decade, were suddenly put in charge. And it makes one wonder about the neocons, who were many of them former leftists, and they decided that they were going to switch to Republicanism and then decide that they were going to be put in charge. And the Republican Party and the conservative movement went ahead and put them in charge. And we see that now with former leftists. And, Donald Trump was a Democrat at one point in time. Elon Musk was a Democrat at one point in time. Now, these were not like vociferous leftist activists. Donald Trump was never a leftist activist, and he comes from a sort of older version of the Democrats that are not quite so off the wall as they are today. And so we can give people a bit of leeway, I think, in realizing that the team that they're playing for has gone batshit bananas. But at some point, you have to wonder, why are we constantly putting noobs in charge? And do they really understand the movement that they're joining? Do these former communists who are now on this bloodthirsty anti-communist crusade against their old allies, they have some reason why they're not just like anti-communist, but vociferously anti-communist, aggressively anti-communist? Why we put those people in charge? Do they even understand what conservatism is? Do they understand what right wing is? And do they carry with them some kind of psychological unbalance that makes them so anti-communist? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but it certainly comes up frequently that we're being led by former communists. It's always a little odd. And yet, sometimes I wonder if you look at the people who have been diehard Republicans for their whole lives, you wind up with folks like John McCain and Lindsey Graham. You wind up with folks that just don't have the fighting spirit in them. Maybe someone who converts from leftism to rightism sees something dangerous in the left, and that's why they converted, because something on that side just rubbed them the wrong way for them to make it a total about face. Something about leftism just shook them to their core, and that was why they flipped to the right. And maybe they're more aggressive in combating the left, whereas people who have been conservative their whole lives, maybe they haven't ever looked at it closely enough to be shook to their core in that way. I don't know. I don't have an answer, but certainly something to think about. At any rate, I'm going to wrap it up right there. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.